Welcome back, ladies and gentlemen, to Poker Distilled. We are here today to discuss one of the works of the late Alan Watts, who is a philosopher who sort of dabbled in Far Eastern philosophies and bringing them to us in the West. This is also a podcast about poker, so don't switch off because we're going to get to that in a minute. How you doing, Melissa? I believe you have a quote you want to start today's episode off with.
Pete, I return in every baby born. That's how I enter every podcast, returning in every baby born. You know where that's from? You know what book that's from?
It's from the book that we just
It's
read.
from the book. It's from the Alan Watts book that we just read. Yes. I know we had some different opinions about this book. I think it'll make for an interesting discussion. I think for me personally, I saw a lot of positive things. I saw some negative things, but I think there's a lot that can be drawn and applied to poker, and I'm excited to talk about it.
Yeah, I think I may have been guilty of some ad hominem thinking as I was reading this book. I think I let my dislike
Well,
of him.
let's start with the title of the book first, because I don't think we did that.
Yeah,
We
okay.
started with
So
that.
anyway, I probably let my dislike interfere a bit too much, but I'm really interested to hear what you've got to say. The title of the book
Okay,
is The Taboo Against Knowing Who You Are.
that's it. Well, it's called the book, and then there's a colon, the taboo against knowing who you are. That's the
Mm-hmm.
full title.
Mm-hmm.
And it starts off as kind of framed as the author posing the question to himself, like, what would I write? Like, what would I put in a book for my children? I think he says, or the next generation. And then he kind of never comes back to that. So he just kind of starts that as like a framework, but becomes distracted and kind of floats off into other directions. But I think it's helpful to start with just a brief background about who Alan Watts was.
Mm-hmm.
Some of you may know him from your YouTube feed. His lectures have become really popular with the Zoomers, as they say. That he's kind of had a resurgence, but he was born in 1915. He died in 1973, and his life was pretty interesting. He was, I think, he was kind of what you would maybe call like an eternal searcher. Like he tried a lot of different things. He got very much into Zen and Buddhism. He married a woman who was a Zen master, and then he actually abandoned that in his 30s and went and got into Christianity and actually became kind of started on the road to becoming like a priest in, I think, in the Orthodox tradition. Dropped out of that, got a theology degree, and then went to teach at Berkeley, and then left Berkeley and started doing a radio show on for free. He didn't get paid for it. It was just like a volunteer, one of these local radio stations that are all over college towns, which are basically just like run by college students and grad students. And he started doing these kinds of weekly lectures, talks, whatever, on spiritualism, Buddhism, philosophy, all of these topics. And they became really popular and it got him a following. And then he actually became quite famous from these lectures and then became a writer and wrote a number of books, one of which is this book, which I think he wrote later in his career. And so I don't think you can't really peg. I mean, I think he's definitely an Eastern, quote unquote, Eastern type philosopher, but I don't think you can peg him in any kind of like, he's not an existentialist. He's not a materialist. He's not kind of in line with any kind of, I think, classic like continental philosophy. He's doing his own thing. And I also think he was very much a man of his time. He kind of was popular in the 60s, 50s, and 60s, a lot of experimentation with LSD, a lot of kind of embrace of the hippie subculture in the United States and around the world. And that, which is fine. I think there's a lot to be said. A lot of good things came out of that era, a lot of bad things came out of that era, but I don't think he was particularly ahead of his time, and I don't think he was particularly someone who will go down in the same breath as, like, I don't know, major philosophers that maybe have lived in the modern era. He's an interesting person, and this is an interesting book. So, with that background, Pete, what did you think of this book, first of all?
I couldn't really finish it. I got the sense that he was making the same point over and over and over again for a lot more pages than was necessary. It jumped about a lot. At one point, he just started raging furiously at Christmas morning and how much he hated it out of nowhere before going back to like the same message of the book. It felt to me as if like if we were to summarize this book in like a premise, conclusion, philosophical argument, it would be something to the effect of it is a tautology that the universe is the only level of specificity at which you can describe something. Therefore, we are just the universe. We're just elements of the universe. We didn't come into it. We came from it. The molecules that we are comprised of had some other role or location at some other point in time in the universe, and they're just reassembled. We're just reassemblies of those molecules. Therefore, we should live our lives in a certain way and we should adopt certain perspectives. But it seemed to presume the fact that it doesn't make sense to talk about things in any other layer of gradability. Like it only makes sense to see the universe as this one thing. And I don't feel like there was ever an argument provided for why that is, or why we shouldn't actually start to see ourselves as parts of it, or why there can't be other layers of things that are also entitled to existence. It just seemed to presuppose that the whole way through, and then he spent most of his time dealing with objections to that. Things that, well, why shouldn't we see things that, like, things other people have said to argue against that perspective? I don't even remember exactly what they are. You're going to have to remind me. But
Well, I think he goes into the idea that well, first of all, I'll start with like what I think is probably his most famous quote, which I think came from this book, which is, "You are the universe looking at itself." So, in other words, we are all connected as human beings on this planet. That we came from the universe, and that the universe essentially, there's no separation between us and the universe. And he uses examples of how you can't describe well, you can describe something in its by a definition of its parts, but ultimately you need to talk about the whole. So we are all parts of the same thing. So there's this connectedness among everyone, and more specifically among consciousness. So by living our everyday lives as individuals and thinking, this is what's going on in my head, this is how I feel at this moment, et cetera, et cetera. These are all, in his opinion, illusions of the ego. And that by essentially losing one's ego, you release this illusion that you are special, and that there really is nothing special about you, because we are all part of the universe. And therefore, allowing yourself, kind of, he gets to this at the end, where allowing yourself to be quote unquote egoless is the key to a kind of contentment, not necessarily like a happiness, but a contentment with everyday life, and with a curiosity for learning, and an interest in kind of a more a better understanding of the people around you, and being able to relate. It'll help you relate to others around you who we may see as different. One of the examples he uses is like politically, which I thought was pretty good. It's like a lot of the problems with political differences is that people see people who think differently of them as kind of foreign, alien, whatever. And his point was that an understanding that these are just illusions of the ego, that we're coming up in our own head as a kind of competition, as a kind of fight over scarce resources, when in reality, these people were all the same. And I think a lot of it is a little bit Pollyannish for me, but I do think there's something to be said for realizing that the ego plays an enormous role in our lives, and it plays an enormous role in how we feel on a day-to-day basis, and in ways that we're not even aware of. I wanted to actually, in reading this, I was reminded of a tweet I saw by Ryan Holiday, who actually is the author of The Obstacle is the Way, which we talked about at our last episode. And I
Mm.
want to read this tweet because I think this is similar to kind of what Watts is saying, but he kind of puts it in a better and maybe a little bit more succinct form. So this is the tweet from Ryan Holiday. When we remove ego, we're left with what is real. What replaces ego is humility, yes, but rock hard humility and confidence. Whereas ego is artificial, this type of confidence can hold weight. Ego is stolen, confidence is earned. Ego is self anointed, its swagger is artifice. One is girding yourself, the other gaslighting. It's the difference between potent and poisonous. And I think this is similar to kind of what Watts is saying, is that when people talk about themselves or their accomplishments, or really most human interactions are based on these kinds of ego contests, and we're doing it for selfish reasons. And he admits, even I am guilty of this in, practicing a spirituality or a Zen, because you're doing it because you think it'll get you something. And he says that there's a thinness to that, there's a hollowness to it, and that ultimately realizing that allows you to kind of embrace with in a deeper way your pursuits in life. And I think that's kind of what I got as the thesis of the book.
Okay. So
Now I'll back up real quick though, just to get what you're saying.
mm,
Before he gets to that point, and this is why one of my criticisms of the book is it could have been a lot shorter,
mm,
because it takes him 110, 15, 20 pages to get to that. He spends the first part of the book kind of building up arguments against this position that we're all the same. The universe looks at us through ourselves, et cetera, which is what you're talking about, Pete. And I think that part is more him playing the role of kind of a lot like a logical philosopher, and I don't think he is at all. He's not someone that's going to make a logical argument for any of this, because it just, I don't think it's possible. And I think maybe you were approaching it as looking for that logical argument and then not seeing it and being like, I'm out.
yeah, I mean, there are people that try and put across logical arguments in metaphysics and ontology, and I wouldn't say I don't have the opinion that the whole game's a bogey and that you can't do it. I just think that he did it poorly, and I don't think it's an excuse when you're writing in a philosophical manner to say, "Oh no, he just shouldn't be read with logic." I think that's absurd. But
Mm-hmm.
okay, let's grant that then, that the preamble for the beginning and middle of the book isn't fully necessary, and the conclusion is still worthwhile. Like I can see how this conclusion that the ego is something that we have cultivated within ourselves as we become more and more sentient is not actually our true nature when we strip things back. And if we get more in touch with that true nature that's not so much ego driven, then we can interact more purely, more curiously with the other parts of the universe. We are one part of the universe. We can interact with the rest of it and all of that. And I don't think we need to accept that the correct way to look at things is that we're all one and we're all just different aspects of the same thing in order to still get some useful moral and self-improvement nuggets out of the latter part. So I just want to say that, like, we can definitely still agree that there are some benefits to what he's recommending doing, regardless of whether or not you accept his ontology.
Mm-hmm.
So let's come to the latter part then. Let's return actually just to something you said about the ego. So Holiday was saying the ego, and what's saying that the ego is this kind of constructed thing. It's about competition. It's selfish. It's about an inward focus. It deludes us away from what we truly are and what we could be doing, and sort of like puts some limit on how beautiful or great or good our life can be in some sense.
Mm-hmm.
I guess one criticism, but one objection maybe could be that we are biological constructs. We are organized into a biological structure that places survival above all else. Like, this has been shown by Darwin, Dawkins, people like this, that
Mm-hmm.
our genes do what they want in order to maximize their chances of being replicated, and we are kind of the vessels for that.
Hmm.
And given that we are in some sense ruled by natural selection and by our genes, and I think you would accept that, Melissa, because you're
Oh yeah, absolutely.
relatively
Yep.
materialist in these matters,
Hmm.
it's it's tempting to say that it's the natural disposition for us to compete with one another for resources. It's natural to say that if you put Holiday or Watts into a horrendous situation and made them fight for their survival, that they would fight for their survival and they would become extremely selfish and they would batter other humans out of the way and gouge their eyes in order to get some
Yeah.
water or daylight or fresh air. I'm thinking about Alistair Urquhart here, the Forgotten Highlander, suffering at the bottom of the ship, like when he's being taken from um, Singapore to
I,
Japan or whatever, and he's like in the.
I'll just quickly say,
Mhm.
I get your point, but I don't know if everyone would. I think a lot of people would just give up and die. But
That's a different trait, though, in natural selection, right? The tribe still has
yeah,
to do that in order to survive as a species.
true.
So
Yes,
while there
yes,
may
yes.
be different roles in the tribe, there's sentry, warrior,
Yeah,
child, um, bearers, people who stay at home and build the buildings, people that design the weapons. There's all these different roles, and you need different dispositions to make that functional. Yes, there
hmm,
do need to be people who just give up, because if everybody fights, then the whole thing dies. So this is a bit like the prisoner's
hmm,
dilemma, or
hmm,
whatever, where if both parties choose steal, then nobody gets anything, right? In
hmm,
those kind of games.
hmm,
So I think as a species, though, we are overwhelmingly naturally wired to compete and try to focus on ourselves and to persist.
hmm,
And I think to say that there's some nobility in the people who are wired with a disposition to give up and not fight for the food is actually just wrong. I don't think there's anything noble
hmm.
about it. I think it's just a different wiring. Maybe there's some nobility in accepting an inevitable demise with grace or something like that. But I don't know, to have a different disposition where you don't fight as hard for food, I don't think there's anything noble inherently about that. But anyway,
Hmm.
I'm kind of digressing. This brings me
Yeah,
back to
yeah.
the point that I find it less intuitive that we are all just part of the same thing and actually don't have ego and self sustenance is actually a delusion. I find that less intuitive than to say we are wired to be egocentric and to be very self-aware and to compete and
Right,
fight for status and resources within the
right.
species.
Yeah. So I would agree. I would say that I don't what Watts is arguing for is a kind of erasure of the self. So this idea, like what the quote I read in the beginning, I return as every baby being born, is he says, there's nothing special about you or how you see the world. That when you die, you'll lose consciousness and there'll be another baby born that will have the exact same viewpoint as you. Because once you get rid of the ego, we all become essentially the same and the universe recognizes itself. Now, I do not like this idea at all. I think I actually think it reminded me a lot of Marxism because one of the foundations of like theoretical Marxism is historical materialism, and historical materialism basically says that like Shakespeare wasn't a genius. There was nothing genius about Shakespeare. Shakespeare just happened to live at a time in history and happened to have certain materials available to him that allowed him to write these plays. Anyone could have done it if they only had the exact same materials that Shakespeare had at that time. So basically, it erases this idea that we are individual, and it's basically this is the foundations of communism, right? Is that all differences are based on class, they're based on the materials that are available to us through our economic system. Some people have more, they're able to do more. Some people have less, they do less. But the people themselves don't control anything. Everyone is replaceable.
Yeah,
We're like,
it's
pieces on a checkerboard.
it's less
And that's kind of
hypocritical.
what this reminded me of. And I don't like that at all.
Yeah, it's less hypocritical than communism, though, because communism assembles a bunch of egos and then says that the collection of the egos is worth more than anything else, is worth way more than the sum of its parts, and then the
Right.
individual is then completely dispensable and reducible to the furthering of I guess it would be the fatherland in the case of the USSR
Right.
or whatever. Whereas
Hmm.
what Watts is saying is that the overall universe itself, which is much, much more than just the human elements of it, that the human elements are actually just like one tiny fragment of this great big universe, it's the universe itself that's actually the important thing, the thing that matters.
Hmm.
So it's not as bad as communism, because communism's kind of like the human doesn't matter, but then somehow the collection
Right.
of the humans matters a ton, and then like the humans have to suffer massively for the connection of humans, which isn't conscious, even though the humans are conscious. This is at least like consistent in that it just wants to do away with like consciousness and ego as something that's like
Hmm.
important. But yeah, I see the analogy there to Marxism. The other problem with this in my mind is that if we look at the universe and we zoom out and we look at like even just a section of it, like our observable part of it, and we
Hmm.
look at like our solar system, and almost all of our solar system is stuff that doesn't really seem to have any importance, to me at least. Like Saturn, or asteroid belts, or moons, or light reaching different planets and stars at different rates, or the radiation belt, or the Milky Way, or the Andromeda galaxy across the road from the Milky Way that's coming towards us really quickly. All of these other parts of the universe are just these patterns. They're just like these mostly completely nothing, but then suddenly filled with these intense balls of annihilation. You have this
Yeah.
canvas of nothing, extremely fast, dangerous bits of rock, toxic, horrendous gases, and then big, burning, bright balls of annihilation, and then loads more nothing before you encounter another cluster of said burning, great balls of annihilation. And it's like, huh, well, if that is the really important thing, this is maybe where I'm more of a humanist here, but if that's the important thing, is all of that collectively zoomed out through time and space, then it's actually a bit shit. But it does have some really interesting features, it would seem, which are like the species on certain planets in Goldilocks zones or whatnot that have constructed
Mm.
citadels and societies and ideas like communism and capitalism and corporatism, and, you know, that do all of this weird shit, that write down these words on these bits of paper and these tomes and etch things into the walls of caves and build telescopes that can look out into all the nothing. Like, what's more interesting,
Mm.
this gigantic band of nothing with balls of obliteration in it, or like these fucking tiny creatures that can build machines to observe that even though it's miles away? I think the latter. So I guess my main objection here to Watts is, actually, if the universe should be observed as this one great big grand thing, not only are we just a part of it, but we are like a microscopic atom
Right.
in a lemon. Like, we are
Yeah.
nothing, but yet we are clearly much more than that in an intellectual level. The
Hmm.
ideas that we're forming are just worth clearly like more
Yeah.
than that. We're not just these random iterations of bits of rock and carbon and
Yeah.
stuff like that. So I don't like it. I don't like the fact that he's
Yeah.
reducing us to, if he was reducing us to part of, like, if the universe was like a big marauding rhinoceros that wandered across the place interacting with other rhinoceroses, rhinoceri, whatever, and we were like one of its toes, like planet Earth was one of its toes, or the solar system was one of its toes, or something. Okay, that's kind of interesting. Maybe now the big, giant, zoomed out thing is really interesting. But it appears to me that if we only go so far to say our universe as we observe it, that's a shit thing. But maybe we
Hmm.
have to go even further. Maybe like outside of our universe is a multiverse. Maybe that's the case, and maybe
Hmm.
there is something way more interesting than what we can
Hmm.
see. It could just be that like what we look out and see is just nothing, but like above that there's
Yeah.
something much more meaningful. But it seems, if we follow Watts's argument, that we're actually just saying we're a tiny insignificant part of something that is mostly benign and shit and lifeless and boring, basically.
He says, yeah, he says, this is a sentence that your point reminded me of. Likewise, when you are dead, you will be as you were before you were conceived. So there has been a flash of consciousness, a flash of galaxies. It happened, even if there was no one left to remember. And what he's saying that is that like what we're experiencing is just basically a flash in the history of the universe, right? And that ultimately there'll be nothing left. I mean, maybe the universe will go on forever, but humanity certainly won't. And so maybe, at some point it's just going to be where every human will be gone. And so there'll be no memory of us at all. So this idea that what we do is somehow, this again is his point of reducing everyone, like getting rid of the ego, like is worth it. Getting into these ego battles is worth it is just not the case. And I like how he describes life as a flash of galaxies. Like not just our life, but the Milky Way, what we live in now is a flash. And I think it's that way of reducing things to reducing us to the bigger picture and setting us against our and kind of making an argument for what would be our place in this vast universe. Um, I think we should maybe relate this to poker before we lose everyone turning it off.
Too late.
But what I want to say is where I saw some connection with poker and I think some helpful points is obviously the idea of ego is a huge part of every poker player.
Mm-hmm.
And you actually, Pete, had a tweet, I think it was yesterday, where
Mm-hmm.
you made some comment about, and I know it frustrates you when people put up their tournament results on Twitter or on X, I should say.
Mm-hmm.
It was a post on X, and you made some comment about how like I want to see people who finish 215th put up their, post on X about their results rather than people who finish, number one or number two. And I agree with that 100%. I don't follow a lot of poker players on X for that reason, is because it just turns into I won, and like there's enough people playing poker and on Twitter that it can appear to you that everyone is winning except you. That's what it can feel like. And even like I think there's more tournament players that post on Twitter than cash
Oh
game
yeah, by
players. And
far.
I understand there's reasons for that, especially if you're getting staked or you want to, you need to establish a reputation and all of that. There's business reasons for that. I get that. I'm not saying everyone is out there just trying to show off. I get it. Like you need to stand out. There's a million poker players these days that play tournaments and are trying to make a living. But it from this perspective of someone just reading it, it can just be awful. So for that reason, I don't follow a lot of poker players, but maybe you do. I think maybe you do, Pete, because it's more of your directly because of your business. But
Mm-hmm.
what reminded me of when I read Watts and I got to the end of it and this talk about ego, I thought about that. And I thought about using social media for any reason whatsoever. And deep down, what are the reasons for that? And how does that play into how we feel about ourselves as players? And also, I think when we are playing and someone else is winning and we're losing, or we feel like someone's trying to level you, or someone keeps check raising you, and I'm like, I'm getting bullied, I'm getting bullied, I'm getting bullied, I'm getting bullied. I think these are all weaknesses of the ego that can be traced back to what Watts is getting at. And if you're going to take anything away from this book, in my opinion, it's that. It's to be aware of those tricks that your ego is playing on you, which then cause you to react in ways that are far from optimal.
Yeah, yeah. I think this is a huge thing. I think we mostly already know that the more we focus on ourselves, the more miserable we become as poker players, and the more we focus outwardly on the game and the more curious we are about it as a higher purpose thing that we've talked about many times in this podcast, the happier we are and the more content we are to play poker. I guess the social media thing is hyper self-focused. It's like I won the tournament. The tournament mattered in relation to me. It wasn't the game that mattered. It was the fact that this happened in my life and I have more tokens to spend on boats now or whatever. Yeah, I mean, I agree. I'm always telling my students to, when they're running bad, to try to cultivate a sense of self-minimization and to cast their lens outward towards the game and the spots and the curiosity of it and how they should be playing and just the marvel of it. And I think that really, really helps. And I think that when you're in the red mist of getting pummeled in a session or you're having a really bad losing week or month, it's very, very easy to make yourself the protagonist and frame everyone else as a evil dragon and to see your opponent as some tyrant that's bullying you and looking to prey on your weakness. And it does come from the self-image of the victim. It comes from fragility. It comes from like a heightened sense of your own ego at a time when the world is making it hard for you. It's like doing things that are difficult for you to bear.
Mm-hmm.
And there's not really an escape from that other than to look elsewhere than yourself. But it's very, very hard to look elsewhere than yourself because of the way consciousness works and the way it's fragmented, you only actually have access to your own lens. And while you can train your mind's eye on objective things and sort of scan over them and observe them and stuff, they too still exist just within you. Like if you look at like, I think he talks about this in the book, but if you look at like I look at this flask, I'm not actually,
It's a water flask for those listening. It's not full of whiskey.
it's actually just
Or maybe it is.
straight vodka.
Okay.
No, it's
Clear liquid.
I've drunk most of it. There's a little bit of vodka left. As you can tell by the quality of my rambling today. You're not actually seeing it. You're seeing like the only thing you're actually conscious of, the thing that's in your consciousness is the image of it in your mind, right? It's like the beams of light as they're refracted within the bit behind your eyes, like at the back of your head. That's what you're actually interacting with. That's what you're experiencing. And that's you looking outward. That's you looking at something external. Never mind like paying attention to the bodily sensations and all of these things that are going on. So whether we like it or not, our full experience of the world is within ourselves. Like it's either in our brain or it's in our body. There's nothing we can experience that's not us. We can't experience something that's happening elsewhere when we have no sensory organs trained on that thing. And therefore, it's nearly impossible to just wave the magic wand and be like, okay, cool, so I can see that being an egotistical creature and being self-centered is the source of my problems. I can see that. Yeah, I think it's nearly impossible most of the time to then just suddenly become totally outward and curious, even though you know the more you can do that, the better. It's such a hard thing to do, especially when you're running bad and you're feeling fragile and victimized by the game and stuff. So I guess a lot of people listening to this are probably like, yeah, if only I could do that. If only I could like sit there in hour 6 of a losing session with this asshole on my right, like making fun of me and just be like, oh, how fascinating that hand happened with the pocket sevens. If only I could do that.
Yeah.
But how do we actually get away from the ego? Like how do we have to train ourselves in stoicism? We have to do all of this stuff. It's hard. I mean, it's not like because we've had this epiphany from reading Watts that we now begin to see ourselves as just this one meaningless thing and we begin to see the universe as the whole. That doesn't change the fact that we're still wired biologically for self-preservance and all of that. So I don't know what we do about it.
What do you think about this? I'm going to ask you this question. I was playing this a couple weeks ago, and a player that he's a reg, kind of younger guy, but a good player. And he said to me at some point, I don't have tilt problems because I go in every session expecting to lose. And so when I do well, it feels like a surprise, like a bonus, like a gift. And when I do poorly, it feels like, well, that was what I expected to happen. So it doesn't come as a shock. What is your opinion of that statement, Pete?
My opinion is that person is so bad at handling adversity that they've had to skew their view of the universe to a permanent despair in order to actually cope. It feels like he's burnt down his own castle so that nobody else can burn it down.
Yes. Yeah. Okay. Well, interesting. Burn down your own castle so no one can burn it down. It's like when the army arrives, you're just standing next to like a burning husk, like a smoldering husk, and you're like, "Ha, too late now."
Well, the Russians did this when they were pursuing the Germans out of Russia. They burnt down all the houses that they could possibly hide in, killing their own civilians, things like this. Talking about communism.
That's so interesting. Yeah.
So, but yeah, there's a lot of that. I'll give you a version of that happens within a hand. Is when the student says, "I potted the turn with this marginal hand that just got worse." Like I was talking to a student the other day that had tens and played a fairly big pot with pocket tens. They like raised big pre some guy called. It's like one of these games with loads of limpers, so it's a 2-bet pot, but it's the size of an online 3-bet pot. Like one of these ones.
Yeah.
Flop is like 8, 7, 8, 7, 4 two-tone, like with the flush draw, and he pots the flop or something, and the guy calls and it turns a 9. He's got an overpair with an open ender, and he gets an SPR 2 or something, and he just pots the turn for like $200. And he's confessing that he's like tilted at this point, and he's, you know,
Yeah.
just motivated by the urge to cause maximum loss himself now, so that if the opponent jams, there's no decision and it's just shrug, call it off. So poker players do this when they intentionally commit themselves, sometimes above and beyond the strength of their hand, right? Thus committing a polarization mistake, so that when the next decision point comes, they don't have to suffer the shock, the fortune reversal. They do it to themselves. So that's burning down your own castle so that no one else can burn it down in a hand. And then there's doing that in your poker life, which I've never heard of before, but that's what your chap seems to be doing here, where he's saying, my outlook is so desolate and negative that I'm just permanently in a state of accepting a grim reality, and therefore I can never be surprised. Like he hates the feeling of surprised disappointment so much that he has chosen a path of desolation.
Well, it's cynicism.
Cynicism. Well, it's beyond. It's beyond cynicism.
It's nihilism, right?
Yeah.
Isn't that nihilism?
It's beyond cynicism for sure.
Yeah. It's nihilism. I mean, it's like it's that was kind of my feeling about it. I wanted to also say this I kind of realized this just in during the course of our conversation, is like this idea of like, we are the universe looking back at itself. We're all connected. That comes from Watts. One way that I think this connects with poker is I do think that you're essentially, when you're playing poker, you're essentially playing against yourself, because you're the way you, so in other words, like when something happens, you recognize that as being something you're either trained and familiar with and can respond to in a way that is based on, you know, your training, your study, etc., or maybe just something that you've seen a lot, your experience, or it's foreign. But no matter what, it's based on what you yourself have experienced. And so I think that for me, one of the things that causes me a lot of frustration in a game is when a player does something that I find has, obviously it'll have no basis in theory because a lot of people don't understand theory and they're not playing that way and blah, blah, blah. But it also has no basis in any kind of like a logical thought process. So, for instance, like not even recognizing that, the 3-bet pot, the 3-better, if an ace hits, it's likely that they have an ace. Like not even recognizing that, not even caring, or a king, something like that. And I think one of the things that I can take from Watts is I'm playing not against a player who is, I mean, yes, there's another human being there, but I'm playing against I'm bringing my own history, my own personal experience, my knowledge, my sense of logic. I'm bringing me to the poker table, and I'm playing against me in a sense that I will react based on me. There's nothing outside of me there. And so when I get frustrated because I make a mistake or because I feel like, I haven't played well, it's not necessarily because of how the other person played. It's because of how I played. Every once in a while, you can get like, oh my God, I can't believe this person jammed there or whatever. But at the end of the day, it's like, it's you. And that's what poker is. It's you. It's not a team sport. And so I guess all of this is a long way of saying that it's helpful to recognize that, because once you recognize that, you stop assigning blame or maybe putting it, poker won't feel as foreign or doesn't feel as foreign. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
I don't think I'm being very clear.
No, I think I get what you're mainly saying. I think people do project themselves into every poker analysis. So even when they are annoyed and disparaging to their opponent for their play, they're projecting it as, I would never do that, and you have, therefore you're worse than me, and you don't deserve that pot. You shouldn't take that pot from me. Sebastian Wen, one of our coaches in the subscriber video library, has a video called The Toughest Villain, beating the toughest villain, and the toughest villain is yourself. It's a mental game. video mostly.
It's a
Um,
great video. I've watched it.
nice. Yes,
Yeah.
he's a talented guy,
His
Sebastian.
videos are great. I'm a big fan,
Yep.
Sebastian.
Shout out Sebastian. So yeah, so once you realize that it's all just about you, and all the stuff that other people do is actually just an input on a conveyor belt, and you're like the conveyor belt operator. I used to like draw a picture of this like way back in my MS PowerPoint coaching days. It was like a guy on a conveyor belt just taking a hand, stamping EV on it, not true EV because it didn't exist at the time, sending it on its way and having this big bucket of well played hands at the end of the conveyor belt. And if you can get into that frame of mind while also being really curious about the bits and bobs that come by and what you can do to them to make them better bits and bobs as you send them on their way in the EV belt, it's kind of sanitizing to your mental health, I think, because
Mm-hmm.
you're no
Mm-hmm.
longer suffering from the illusion that it matters what anybody else thinks or does. Well, it does matter a bit, but only insofar as like what they do affects your EV and your strategy.
Mm-hmm.
Um, and I think that's helpful. And when I'm playing my best poker, it's definitely when I'm sat back and there's me in poker and I'm interacting with poker. This is where Watts' view doesn't fit well with me because in order for me to be interacting with poker, I can't just become a part of it because then I'm no different to like any of the other bits of it. Like a bet is a part of poker and so am I. The felt is a part of poker and so am I. The king of clubs is a part of poker and so am I. No, no, we're not the same thing. The king of clubs is a thing that it's like a little tool in my hand that I can manipulate in certain ways using other tools. So I don't see how we get away from the, as a poker player, how we get away from the fact that we are the agent who's solely responsible for how well we play, and then the other stuff
Mm-hmm.
comes across us and we make do with it as best we can.
Mm-hmm.
And when we take what's this view that like we're just an aspect of this big great game or universe or whatever, I feel like we actually lose ourselves in the game and just become another cog in the poker system. But
Mm-hmm.
really, I play my best poker when I'm like very clear that there's me and the things I can influence, like in a stoic sense, right? Like don't try to control
Mm-hmm.
the things you can't control, and then there's the stuff that I can interact with, and sometimes I can make that stuff improve my expectation, and sometimes I'm just gonna lose regardless of what I do, and that's
Mm-hmm.
the stuff I'm getting that day. And I really like that distinction. I like that separation. I like to see myself as a completely distinct part of the universe from
Mm-hmm.
poker so that I can interact with poker as like a heterogeneous pair so that I can be one side
Mm-hmm.
of it and it can be the other side and I can have this like control over the things I can influence and what I can't. So I think there's actually like a lot of problems with being stoic if you accept what's his view of the universe because it almost descends into like a chaotic nihilism of like anything goes and I can do whatever the fuck I want and it doesn't matter anymore
Yeah.
because I'm just going to give up the
Right.
ego and slide with the current down the mountain, slide with the mudslide
Right.
and just be a normal part of it. And it's like, well,
Yeah.
you'll never have any
Yeah.
especially good layer of success then because in poker you have to be composed, deliberate as an agent and distinct from all the rabble and randomness and chaos around you. We talked about chaos and order in the second ever episode of this podcast that we did.
Yeah.
And it does seem to me that while the universe itself may have some kind of vague order, it's not a particularly important one, as evidenced by the random belts of rocks flying into things and obliterating them. And therefore, the order that we impose is true order, whereas some of the order that we see in the universe is actually just chaos disguised in a regular pattern so that it seems orderly.
Mm-hmm.
The human in this
Yeah.
view and the poker player in this view have the ability to impose order on the
Mm-hmm.
environment to a far greater extent than the universe itself can because
Yeah.
it's inherently chaotic.
Yeah. I think my biggest disagreement with Watts's theory is that I do believe that we are unique. And I do believe that after we're gone, there'll never be another person on the planet like us. I think that we every person brings a uniqueness to how they view the world and how they interact with the world. And even, people that are in many ways act like carbon copies of each other are still in their own way unique in ways that we're not even aware of. And I feel that way about myself. I feel that way about every other person. And I think bringing that individuality to poker extremely important because you're the value that you bring to poker is you. And that is your creativity, your way of thinking, your way of the discipline you bring to the game. All of these things is you. And no one else is going to do that exactly like you do it. And understanding that is the essence of, I think, kind of why you play. And everything we talk about on this podcast is getting away from playing in those carbon copy ways, right? Doing Standing out from the herd. At
Yeah.
least that's how I play. That's what excites me. Now, for me, this is something I struggle with because I in some ways want to stand out too much, and I find myself in these really absurd places where I've gotten to the turn with a medium strength hand that I realize if I wind the clock back to pre-flop, I think, what am I even doing here? Well, I'm here because I reacted in a way where I wanted to be different. I knew that I was facing a spot that maybe it was I'm out of position, and I check it, and I face a third pot. I ran a bet for a third of the pot. There's a lot of things I can do here, and maybe I'm doing something to be different because I get bored with doing the same things,
Mm.
and I get bored with having to kind of play color in the lines.
Mm-hmm.
And sometimes this works out for me a lot, but sometimes it doesn't,
Yeah.
and sometimes it can cause my sessions to go horribly wrong. But there is a need in me, and there always will be, and there always has been, to not follow the established path and to do something different. And I find that I have to control that because it can easily spiral out of control. But that's a part of me, and I love that part of me, and I embrace that part of me, and that's what makes poker fun.
Yeah. And no two poker players have exactly the same game. No two humans are the same. I mean,
Yeah,
if you compare like bits of thread from this carpet to one another, like you started ripping up some bits of thread and you ripped up 600 of them and you put them on the desk, you examined them under a microscope, you would see the same thing, basically.
yeah,
If you examined 100 humans, not only would they be different biologically in certain ways, but the conscious layer is so diverse with humans. It's capable of diversion that physical things that aren't conscious don't appear to be capable of, to me at least. So another problem I have with Watts is that if we're all just parts of the same thing and we're just the same aspect, we're just another aspect of the universe, just like a mountain is, that feels really wrong to me because surely we're more important than a mountain and we're more marvelous than a mountain because while a mountain presumably doesn't have any kind of consciousness and has no experience, we have an inner world playing out. There's something it's like to be us and there's sensations and thoughts and experiences that it's like for us to have. And that to me is like fucking amazing. Like I almost feel like
yeah,
what's his view by just saying we're no more important than some other random part of the universe is to say that consciousness doesn't matter, that it's not interesting or exciting, and it's not something that we should care about. It's just some random feature that's arisen in us, and we shouldn't care that we have it. But consciousness is fucking amazing. And to relate this back to poker, self-aware poker players that can actually step back and be like, wow, I was putting him on a draw because I just wanted to bet and wanted the hand to be over with. That's why I was doing that. It wasn't that I was actually being objective. They're capable of so much more progress than ones that are just like, I want to say they're inanimate. They're like unconscious to
mm-hmm.
an extent. They're not fully unconscious, obviously, you'd imagine, but they're less self-aware, less sentient, let's say, than someone that can be more reflective and looking at their own game and the
Mm-hmm.
workings of their own mind. So yeah, I just think that like the most self-aware, while like being really self-aware and not being immersed in the world creates like depression and insanity, the
Mm-hmm.
fact that we're capable of self-awareness and we're capable of consciousness has to be a thing that we can actually capitalize on, both as poker players and just people in life. And like to say that
Yeah.
we're just no more important than other aspects of the universe is to dismiss consciousness as something that doesn't matter when it's the most different thing about a human and the rest of the, okay, maybe some animals too, but the most different things about pigs, humans, dogs, and creatures that we think are clearly conscious and things that aren't is that consciousness. It's the most important difference as far as I'm concerned. And I think when we do away with that, we just descend into pointless nihilism. Like if you had the consciousness of a rock, It wouldn't matter to you whether you were torn apart by hyenas or were in a nice bubble bath. It would be the same thing. I choose the
Yeah.
bubble bath because it matters to conscious organisms, and that's kind of what makes us better than rocks.
So that's the takeaway from today. Choose the bubble bath.
Not the hyenas.
That's the takeaway. Not the hyenas. Well, if you read this book, I know there's a few people on our Discord who have said that they picked it up. Please leave either a comment here or in the Discord if you're part of CPS and you have some thoughts on the book. It'd be really interesting to hear some other perspectives. I have an idea for another book, the next one we could read. And this one, Watts made me want to read a quote unquote, I don't know, like a real philosopher, maybe. I don't know. But I have this book here that has been on my shelf for a while. I have never gotten to reading it, and I want to read it. It's really short, and it's by Soren Kierkegaard, and it's called Fear and Trembling. And it is a book about faith, and it definitely uses a Bible story as a launching point to talk about faith. Not faith necessarily in God, that's part of it, but faith in general. I don't know. I haven't read it yet.
Well, you know, what is faith if not in God, huh?
There we go. There it is. There it is.
He's back.
He's back. This is for another episode, but I've changed my opinion on him once again, and he's back in my good graces.
Back in favor.
But he's back in good graces, and a lot of that is because of well, there's a lot of reasons, but
okay.
I have a hard stop, so I can't continue to
I look forward to hearing them next week. I'm intrigued.
Do you want to read this?
Yeah, that sounds great. The guy
is okay with that?
Yeah.
It's like 100 pages, and I actually have this amazing, it's like the Penguin Books Great Ideas copy, and it is like one of the most beautiful covers, like for a paperback. It's got a quote from the book, and the quote is, "This will whet our appetites. If there were no eternal consciousness in a man, if at the bottom of everything there were only a wild ferment, a power that twisting in dark passions produced everything great or inconsequential, if an unfathomable, insatiable emptiness lay hid beneath everything, what would life be but despair?" So that's like imprinted on the cover of this book. I just love this cover. I am in love with this whole book, like how it's presented, and this paperback is really beautiful. But this is the Penguin Great Ideas version if you want to pick that up. Sure, it's on Amazon, super cheap. But yeah, let's talk some Kierkegaard next week.
So you're giving me 1 week to read this and have it arrive?
No, we could. I have actually something we can read in the interim. It's I saw this on Twitter, and I thought, oh, this will be something we can talk about. It's Bertrand Russell's 10 Rules.
Love it.
So there's 10 rules, and number 1 is do not feel absolutely certain of anything. So
nice.
We can talk about that next week as in the interim, and maybe we give ourselves 2 weeks to read Kierkegaard.
Love it.
It's a little bit heavy maybe, but I think it'll be really interesting.
I think that'll be fun.
And we'll apply it to poker. It's always going to be a poker connection. This is the first poker podcast in the history of poker podcasts that incorporates reading books of philosophy to poker.
Yep. And
thank you for joining us and for reading along and for being part of this. And that's all I got for today. We are the universe looking back at itself.
Or not. All right, guys. We're also the first poker podcast, by the way, in the history of poker podcasts, not to constantly talk about who won what tournament last week. And we're very proud of that fact. All right, guys. You know what to do. Leave us a comment on YouTube, a comment on Discord, a share on Spotify, a rating on Spotify, and we'll see you back next week for more philosophy and poker on Poker Distilled. Bye-bye.
I'm hushing the dog on the chain. I'm lining up stones on the edge of the bank. Rally the troops for another refrain. I sing this softly to myself. I sing this softly to myself. I'm buried beneath the sand. There There's no way to speak or reach out my hand, watching the paper slowly unfold, bracing for news that I can't bear to hold, while I'm singing this song to myself. I sing this softly to myself. Tore up my jeans on the fence, this iron road I cannot bend, but my walking is lighter when I walk with a friend. I sing this softly to myself. I sing this softly to myself. I'm waking up early again, sitting